Good morning, Highland. My name is John Boyles. I'm glad to be back with you here at the end of this series. I got to start the series off, and Charles invited me to finish the series off. If you don't remember, my wife and I, we moved here about 4.5 years ago, and we had our first child here. He was born back in February. His name's Guy Wallace, and you can see him on the screen now. And he's just been such a joy, and I have to say it's been so strange that he has never been in the building. He's never been in the auditorium. These have been such strange times, and he's never met most of you. He's heard about some of you, and he's seen some of you from a distance, and some of you he's seen in a little bit closer proximity. But I look forward to the day when we can all return, and you can meet him, and we'll be past this pandemic. You can hug him, and he can hug you, and experience the joy of our community. So this series on John, we're covering the first 11 chapters of John. Today will be our last of these 11 classes, and it was titled, We Would See Jesus. And I hope that you have seen Jesus over the course of these weeks. Let me share with you some of the ways that I've seen Jesus. I think we've seen Jesus with Jana as the gate to heaven, and we've experienced his call and the call to make a path for him. We've seen Jesus with Paul as someone with whom we can spend time so we can know him and whom we can see in others' lives through their joy. We have seen Jesus with Vic as we heard about the way God's Spirit transforms history and our systems, challenging us to rest in Jesus rather than in our religious systems. We've seen Jesus with Dan as the deeper well that quenches our thirst and transforms us, just as it transformed that Samaritan woman into an evangelist. We've seen Jesus with Mike as the point of the Scriptures and the point of the signs in this gospel, as the one who shows us God the Father. We've seen Jesus with Dana as we entered into the feeding story, wondering why this story was important to early Christians and why it's important to us today. And we've seen Jesus with Carson as the fullness of God and someone to whom we can entrust ourselves, even when everything around us is tumultuous and tempts us not to trust or believe. We've seen Jesus with Brad as not only the Messiah, but as God in the flesh, and someone that we can be confident in his messiahship and in the incarnation as true. And we've seen Jesus with Randy as we hope to not only see the miracle, but to see the sign that points to Jesus, a sign that can move us towards faith. And we've seen Jesus with Wes as a shepherd who protects and provides, as someone whom we remember, celebrate, and imitate. I'm thankful for all of our teachers over the course of this series and the insights that they've brought to us. And I'm going to invite you now, at the opening of this final class in our series, to think back to one of the questions I asked at the end of the first one. I asked you to consider, over the course of our time reading this gospel together, how John, as a gospel, as a text, invites us into belief in Jesus and or sustains our belief in Jesus. And so I want to invite you now to pause the video for a few minutes and write about this. Reflect on it. How have you encountered Jesus over the course of these weeks, and how has that encounter invited you into belief or sustained your belief in important ways? If you're with people, you can talk with them as well, but I encourage you to do some individual writing before you do. So go ahead and pause the video here for a few minutes and reflect, write, maybe share. So now that you're back, in our final class today, we will see Jesus one more time. And we'll see Jesus at the first of these very climactic miracles in this gospel. This one in John chapter 11, where you can go ahead and turn, that's where we'll be. We'll see Jesus with Martha and Mary. And we'll see Jesus with Lazarus. So in our opening class, I talked about how Jesus in this gospel is shown in the most divine and also as the most human out of all of our gospels. And as some of our other teachers have pointed out, when we see Jesus in this way, in these ways, as fully human and fully divine, we are also seeing God in these ways. And John is clear to us in telling us that Jesus is the one who rightly and fully reveals the Father to us, reveals God to us. And so as we read this story today, I want to invite all of us to consider the ways that we see Jesus and how Jesus shows us God, and also how we see ourselves as humans in the course of this text. So in John chapter 11, starting in verse 1, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. Rather it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.' Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was." I'm going to pause here and think with you for a second, because this always has struck me as a little bit odd. Here we have Jesus, and the text is very clear. He really loves these people. He loves Lazarus, he loves Mary, he loves Martha. It tells us ways they're connected, some of them quite intimate. Mary being the one who anointed him with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. These are not just any people, and they're not just any Jews. These are people Jesus is connected to. And we see one of the ways that Jesus is very divine in this moment, because it says that Jesus hears about Lazarus being sick, and he knows and says, "This illness does not lead to death." But rather he knows that the purpose of the illness is something other, that it is to reveal God's glory, and that it's going to show the way that the Son of God can be glorified. And then comes the part that's odd to me. It says in verse 5 and 6 that even though Jesus loves these people, that he stays 2 days longer where he is, instead of going to heal them, or to heal Lazarus. And this sets up a tension that will continue through the rest of this gospel, because people know, they've perhaps even rightly seen who Jesus is in the way that he can heal illness. And so they wonder, as we might wonder, where is Jesus? Why isn't he here? Perhaps we wonder that now in the course of this global pandemic. Where is Jesus? Where is God? Why is it that things are still so hard and sometimes feel as if they will always be hard? In verse 7, "Then after this, Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them.' After saying this, he told them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him.' The disciples said to him, 'Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right.' Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, 'Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.' Thomas, who was called the Twin, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, that we may die with him.'" This section I always chuckle a little bit at Thomas's comment. Of course, we won't be able to read together to the end of the gospel, but Thomas comes back in a similar vein, and I have such appreciation for Thomas. Here he's the realist, right? The text has told us, and the disciples have told Jesus, they've reminded him, these are the very people that have just tried to kill you. It was just last chapter, Jesus. Don't you remember? How short is your memory? And so Thomas, very resignedly, I imagine, says, "Well, I guess let's just go with them so that we can be killed too." Just as I think Thomas later on, when he earns his name that perhaps is unwarranted, I might say, or perhaps not in the way that we would think about it, as Doubting Thomas. Because Thomas, again, he's a realist. Thomas says at the resurrection that he will not believe unless he sees the holes in Jesus' hands and puts his hand in Jesus' side. Thomas wants to witness because Thomas is a realist. Perhaps you find yourself there as well, feeling like Thomas. Oh, we all know what's going to happen, but I guess we'll just stick it out with Jesus because that's what we do as Christians. Notice that Jesus doesn't have any comment for Thomas. Just as I would point out that later on in the gospel, Jesus doesn't condemn Thomas for saying what he says about needing to see and to feel Jesus to believe. I think that's interesting and worth considering. But this little short section of verses 7 to 16, they put on display so much of what's going on in this gospel. There's this imagery of light and dark, and Jesus is connected to the light so that people can see. And there's this imagery of sight, being able to see. And so much of this gospel is about who can really see Jesus and how Jesus is visible and shown. And at the same time, the disciples, these are the folks that I can relate to the most, I think. They don't understand this language. They've been around Jesus, they've heard Jesus talk in all the ways that Jesus has talked in this gospel, but they think when Jesus says that Lazarus has fallen asleep, that means that he's finally sleeping and therefore his body will recover. But Jesus, again, is not speaking literally. And I deeply appreciate the narrator here who says, "Then Jesus told them plainly." I almost imagine that the narrator is kind of winking at us and saying, well, at last, Jesus speaks clearly. And then Jesus' comment, of course, is very blunt. Lazarus is dead. And what Jesus says next, I think, challenges me. Perhaps it challenges you too. Because what Jesus says is that he's glad that he wasn't there to heal Lazarus. In other words, he's glad that Lazarus died. I think that's very odd. And when we see what comes next, the way that Lazarus' death causes such mourning and such sadness and such pain, I think this causes us to pause and wonder about whether or not a tendency that I have and that you may share with me to think that avoiding pain, avoiding sadness, avoiding badness is kind of the point of life sometimes. That God wants us to be happy. Because this text invites us to think maybe that's not what God wants most. Because Jesus says that he's glad because this means that the disciples can believe the fact that Lazarus was dead and that Jesus wasn't there. Just keep that in mind. We'll come back to it in a little bit. In verse 17, when Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." This is such a fascinating encounter to me. Martha runs to meet Jesus in the midst of her mourning. And it shows us, I think, here the ways that there's this deep connection between these two women and their brother and Jesus. As soon as she hears, she's off to see Jesus. And when she sees him, I think this question, it's bold. Her greeting that implies a question. And it's honest. She says, "Lord," addressing Jesus with this title that's both connected to God and connected to Caesar in the ancient world. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." There's this pronouncement of profound faith in calling Jesus Lord and in the confidence that he could have healed Lazarus, at the same time that there's a question. Where were you? Why weren't you here? And she follows it up with even more faith, which I feel that I can relate to this so much. This feels like my prayers sometimes. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. I may feel like perhaps I was a little too honest with God, maybe a little too blunt, maybe bordering on disrespect or faithlessness. And so I follow it up with a statement of faith, as Martha does here. I know that God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus' response to Martha in this moment, I think in many ways is in the vein of this kind of divine Jesus. Because what he says is, your brother will rise again. A pronouncement of certainty and a pronouncement of power. And Martha responds with, more faith. I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. I know you're right, Jesus, but I still kind of wonder, where were you? If you had been here, my brother would not have died. If you had been here, this bad thing would not have happened. And Jesus' response continues in this vein of what feels, I think, very divine Jesus. I am the resurrection and the life. As we've heard before, these I am statements are profound statements, claims of divinity, and claims also of identity. Who is Jesus? Jesus is the God who brings life to death and life out of death. Jesus is the God that conquers the thing that we're all so certain of. Perhaps you know the quote, the only things that are certain in life are death and taxes. Jesus is the God who says death is not certain. The Father, the God who brings resurrection into the depths of our worst times. And then he says a question. Do you believe this? And Martha follows up and she says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. And I love Martha's example here because she doesn't go back to her question once more. And I don't think that, I like to imagine at least, that she doesn't even know the fullness of what she's saying. But she says it anyway. And this is my experience, I think, sometimes. I don't know the fullness of what I'm saying when I say, I believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Martha's not quite sure what all she means, but she knows she believes it. Let's see what Mary encounters. In verse 28, when she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? We see here Mary's encounter with Jesus. And she asks the same exact question that Martha asked. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And here we see a different response. Here we see, I think, on full display the connection to humanity in Jesus, the depths of Jesus' humanity, that will come even more to the fore in the next section when Jesus himself begins to weep. Jesus is human. He understands the hardship in this moment. When he sees them weeping, he asks where they've laid him, going to the place where he can mourn, reacting with this kind of emotion and sympathy. And the people react by noticing it. And some of them, they react, they say, see how he loved Lazarus. He is human. He loved this man. At the same time, some of them voice more bluntly the question that Martha and Mary imply. Couldn't this guy who, just 2 chapters ago healed a man who was born blind, something unknown, unseen, impossible, couldn't he have stopped this man from dying? Where was Jesus? And you as a reader, we as readers, Jesus decided not to go. He stayed. And he even told the disciples that he's glad that he didn't go. Interesting. Verse 38. Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." I love Martha's comment here. She's so practical and so realistic. And again, remember that she responds to Jesus ultimately with this profound statement of faith. But she doesn't even know what she's saying. And this is revealed here where she very practically says, "He's been dead a little while, Jesus. It's going to smell. We shouldn't do that." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Do you know, Martha, what you said? What it means to believe? So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. The story comes to an end with Jesus being the resurrection, with Jesus showing the resurrection and the life. And it couldn't end the way that it does if, as Jesus said at the very beginning of the story, he had been there to heal the man. And I wonder, how many of these Jews would have believed if Jesus had come and just healed him? He'd healed other people already in this gospel, so perhaps not very many. But here, many more believed because of the depth of the tragedy and how the sign reveals God as a resurrector, Jesus revealing the Father as the one who undoes the permanence of death, the worstness of death. This is the essence of the gospel proclamation from the very beginning, that Jesus died and that death was undone in resurrection, and that this is who God is. God undoes the power of death, the worst thing that we could experience and that we could imagine. And so when we think about this text, I think it invites us into considering for ourselves, how is God the resurrection and the life? And how can we see that? Again, perhaps God is partly the resurrection and the life, in that God is not here to just make us happy all the time. Perhaps God is here to meet us in tragedy, to mourn with us as Jesus does, to walk with us in the midst of that tragedy. We're in the midst of this global pandemic, and I know that for many of us it's been really hard. For me, some of the depth of that difficulty came on November 6th. I remember it very clearly. I had gone home from campus at ACU in order to eat some lunch, and then I was going to go back to campus and do some additional grading and some other work, take care of some things. It was a Friday, and I had gone for a voluntary testing day the day before, PCR testing. And this was my practice. I was doing this about weekly because of my teaching schedule and the kind of exposure and the fact that we have my 10-month-old son. And I got a phone call. I'd been waiting for the email, which was what I'd received before, the email that told me my test was negative. But I got a phone call this time, and it was an ACU number. And I answered that phone call, and I knew. As soon as I saw that it was an ACU number, I knew what the call was. And sure enough, the person on the other side of the phone said, "Do you know that your PCR test was positive?" And it was in that moment that my heart sank. And the depths of what I went through over the succeeding days and hours after that, it was challenging. Because I knew in that moment when I got that call, I knew several possibilities. I may have given it to my wife. I may have given it to our son. I also knew that we may not know that immediately. And I was quick to realize and know that in order to keep them safe, I was going to have to remove myself from my 9-month-old son's life for 10 days. That was hard. That was dark. My prayers, sometimes they sounded a bit like Martha and Mary's comments to Jesus, "If you had been here," implying my dissatisfaction, implying my questions of God. Sometimes they were just more blunt and more frustrated and more upset. Perhaps you've had similar experiences. I wonder, and I invite you to wonder and to consider, how have you seen God's miraculous life-giving power over the course of this pandemic? Maybe you're waiting for it, like I was during that time. I will say that the joy of holding my son again after the 10-day period, I don't know that I could have experienced the depth of that joy without the tragedy of seeing him try to get to me and not being able to, as I was having to isolate from him. It was a joy that was different. It was a joy that was profound. And I see God's life-giving power in that I was able to hold him again. God inviting me into the fullness of life again with my family. And I anticipate the day when we'll be invited into the fullness of life again as a community. Perhaps you're waiting for that. Perhaps you haven't seen it yet. And if that's the case, then I invite you in a different way to continue in this Advent season reflecting on and thinking about the ways that you're waiting to see the resurrection power of God. What spiritual practices can you start, continue, or modify as part of your waiting? How can you be fully honest with God? How can you, perhaps, or we, be honest with ourselves, like Martha and Mary, in these spiritual practices? Knowing that God does not condemn you or shy away from your questions. God invites those and responds with, as Jesus did, "I am the resurrection and the life." Do you believe this? An invitation to believe even if we don't see. Now, how do we see ourselves as humans in this text? Well, if we were to keep reading in the book of John, we would find the second half of the book that scholars call the book of glory. And we would find that in the kind of impetus for that glory, and the glory of Jesus, the glory of God in this gospel, is always talking about the crucifixion. Not something we would necessarily traditionally identify as glorious. But the impetus for that crucifixion, if we kept reading chapter 11, you would see, is this very resurrection of Lazarus. This is what causes the Sanhedrin to resolve that Jesus must die. It's highly ironic that this gospel reveals to us our tendency at times to respond to Jesus' resurrection power and Jesus' life with death of our own as humans.